Now I can hear you.
Okay, and I'd like everyone to mute themselves if you don't mind, except the speakers. And so
Yes.
we have Hank from the University of
Yes.
Michigan. We have Miriam Friedmann. Whoever is speaking in the background, please mute yourself.
Between
it's very
LA
difficult.
and Anaheim.
All right, hold on a second.
Yeah. So that's probably 20 minutes from downtown LA.
Hold on.
No.
Who just said you're 20 minutes from downtown LA? Did someone just say? Did someone?
Yes, it's showing that it's David Shemtov.
Married.
All right, I'll find it.
I've seen her husband in pictures, but I haven't met him yet. He looks Japanese. I think he's Japanese.
All right, goodbye, David. So, all right, we have Miriam Friedmann Morris, who is in upstate New York, and we have Zola Shulman, who's zooming in from Cape Town, South Africa. And I really am excited that we've been able to put this program together. This is the second part of our Yom HaShoah Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance program for 2022. I spend a good 6-9 months working on these programs, so I treat them very much like my babies. And I want to, as I talk, I'm admitting more and more people, so it's exciting that we're having a big crowd coming on. I want to make sure that all of you know that we're on Zoom. Zoom is not a foolproof tool, so if you get knocked off, just re-click the link, and I will meet you throughout the program. I want to use a couple tools that Zoom provides us today, and I want to go first to chat. I want you all to click on your toolbar and open chat. You'll see some introductory messages from me that I put in, but I also would like you to use chat. So at this moment, if you can go and put your name and where you're from in chat, it'll be cool to be able to see your location compared to everyone else. And we track all this kind of stuff, so it helps me as well. So right now, do me a favor, just put a quick chat in there, say hello, and from where. Okay, so the next thing I want to kind of show you is that we're going to use the toolbar reactions button. Since we are on multiple screens, and we will be on several screens by the time this is over, you click on the reaction button and you'll see there's a toolbar that says raise your hand. If you look at my screen here, you see that I have just raised my hand. So it'll allow me to bring your tile to the first screen so I can see you, and then I can pick out your questions. We're going to take questions from our speakers after each one presents. So to remember your question, you can just put the question in chat, and those will be the first questions I pull out. I'll open up your mic, you'll come on screen, and you'll be able to ask your questions directly. So if there's not anything further, I want to get started, and I want to share the screen for a second. The first thing I want to do is share with you that I have a yahrzeit candle. And I'm doing a yahrzeit and a memorial candle for all of you, as well as my parents and anybody in memory. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to this video. It's a really special video. It is the You'll know it immediately. This is in Tel Aviv, Israel. On the day of Yom HaShoah.
comes back. It comes back.
So for those of you, many of you know, but those of you who don't know, and there's also non-Jewish people in our group, during Yom HaShoah in Israel, the whole country comes to a complete stop when they hear that blow of the siren for a 2-minute memorial for the victims of the Holocaust. And so that's how we're starting our program today. I want to move from this to introduce Zola Shulman, who is in Cape Town, South Africa. And I want to just hold on one second. And Zola is the daughter of 2 Vilna-born Holocaust survivors, Israel Yutan and Yiddish actress and singer HaShoah Rosenthal. Zola is a singer, songwriter, performance coach, and recording artist who has released a number of original musical albums for both children and adults. She's written music for the film, has performed on many stages in the USA and abroad, taught courses on the Holocaust, and give keynote addresses at Yom HaShoah events. And so we're very honored to have Zola with us. And Zola, please introduce your song. You'll be singing 2 songs. The second song will come in transition after Miriam speaks and Hank then speaks. So please take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. So a little brief introduction about how my parents survived and got to South Africa. My parents did not know each other growing up in Vilna, but my father knew my mother, who she was, because he wrote about her. He was a journalist, and he wrote about this teenage girl who had her songs on the radio and won singing competitions in Yiddish. My mother's brother, Leib Rosenthal, was a well-known poet and activist and storyteller and songwriter. And he wrote songs in the Vilna ghetto, and my mother performed them. So she was known as one of the leading singers. And unfortunately, I did not know my grandparents nor my uncle Leib because they were all murdered in the camps before liberation. So after the war, I guess my mother's sister and my mother and my father survived various labor camps, various concentration camps, and they were liberated during the Death March to the Baltic Sea in 1945. My mother was very, very ill with typhoid, and she had found this abandoned house where they were living in Lauenburg after the war. And my father came across the house and recognized her name as someone who was in the house, and recognized her and nursed her back to health and nursed her to life and into love. And so the romance began. And someone had recognized my father from before when he was working in a printing shop and organized ID papers and work permits so that my parents could both work, and soon got married, living in Poland. And my father was editing in newspapers, and my mother was singing and performing all over the area in various displaced persons camps. And one day, Molly Picon, the famous Yiddish American actress, came to visit the camps in Poland and heard my mother, met my mother, and said, no, this is a talent, must get out of Poland. And so Molly Picon was the reason. She organized papers for my parents to leave Poland. And they left pretending to be on a work permit because it wasn't encouraged to leave. And they had one little suitcase and a $10 note that my mother had hidden in her hair. And they got to Paris. And they both found work, and my mother was already contracted very quickly to sing at a Jewish nightclub every night, and also continued to sing in the various camps around the various places in Europe, the displaced persons for refugees. She also joined the Yiddish State Theatre, and because of that, one day the State Theatre invited actresses and actors to come to South Africa and perform. And that's how my mother got to Cape Town, South Africa. And when she got there, she sent a telegram back to Paris and told my father, "You have to come. This is where I want to live. This is where we can make a difference and bring joy to others and live a beautiful life and put our horrors behind us." So in 1951, they got to South Africa, and my sister was born, Nava, soon after that. And then 8 years later, I was born. My mother didn't talk about her experiences at all with us, only with her Holocaust survivor friends. My father, being a journalist, spoke a lot, wrote a lot of articles, and was very instrumental in bringing the survivors together in Cape Town. They formed a group, the Sherita Pleita, and he also wrote documents and articles and wrote a manuscript for a book about his experiences, which my sister finished after he died. So she had written a book. She also wrote a play about my mother's life, a musical, which is on YouTube. I'll put the info in. And unfortunately, both my parents and my sister have since passed away. And so I am now carrying the legacy forward of my mother's voice and my uncle's songs. And so I begin to sing in Yiddish. And the song that I'm choosing to sing for you now is Mir leben ewig, which means we live forever. And this was written by my Uncle Leib in the Vilna Ghetto and sung by my mother. It speaks of strength and resilience and courage, and the message is very clear in the lyrics. We live forever, the world's ablaze. We live forever, without money these days. We'll show the enemy we will not fight, and we will not play their game. We will not hide our faces in shame. We live forever, we are here. We live forever, in every hour. We want to live and to survive. Bad times we'll overcome and thrive. We live forever. We are still here. Wir leben ewig. Es brennt a Welt. Wir leben ewig. On a Groschen Geld. Und euch zepucken nicht die alles so nimm, was willen uns verschwarzen unser Ponym. Wir leben ewig, wir seien da. Wir leben ewig in jeder Show. Wir wollen leben und erleben schlechter Zeiten, aber überleben. Wir leben ewig. Wir seien da. We are here.
Thank you very much. It was terrific. And we'll hear again from Zola a little later in the program. I'm going to now transfer the presentation over to Miriam, but before we do, I want to play a little video that is a sort of an introduction of David Friedman's work, which is quite interesting. And then the program will be moved into a presentation by Miriam. Hold on 1 minute. David Friedmann was born in 1893 and passed in 1980. He was a renowned Berlin artist during the interwar years, painted his experience from the Lodz ghetto and Auschwitz for the world to see. After his death, Miriam was driven to carry on his mission to show his Holocaust art to the world. Hold on a second, sorry.
I've had the thrill of living my father's journey. I had got to see Auschwitz through his artwork. It was 1980. My mother handed me a little diary that my father had wrote for me on the day that I was born. And in that diary, he explained to me, you know, he had lost his first family and he had come back to Prague. He had cried many tears, but, you know, life has to go on. That's your choice. The way he chose life was to continue with his art. But now it was different because he had survived the Holocaust and he had seen gruesome and horrific things, and he had waited until liberation so that he could show them to the world. And now was his time. I knew him as a Holocaust artist. He painted his experience of the camps, and he didn't really talk very much about that pre-war career. I realized how little I really knew, and I thought I knew so much. And that's when I wanted to go to Europe and find his pre-war works. So my first ambition was to get in touch with the Berlin newspapers, because he had been a leading press artist of his day. And I thought, well, certainly his works would have survived in the newspaper. His diary was about 110 pages, and he himself wrote that he couldn't read it. So he had to read it with a magnifying glass, who was writing it for his daughter, his first daughter, who I was named after, Miriam Helene. And I was very curious about this other Miriam, and my father never spoke about his first family. He actually was doing portraits already in the Lodz ghetto, and he would also paint for himself. And the end of August 44, the Lodz ghetto was liquidated, and he was on the last train to Auschwitz, and he was fortunate to be given to the side of the living. So he made his own paints, and he made his own brushes, and he got on a table and he painted across the barracks wall. And soon the crowd was gathering. People were noticing it, and the capos had called in the SS Obersturmbannführer, who clapped his hands, and he knew he was saved. The Czech government were sending the survivors to a health spa. One day they were sitting at lunch, and he noticed across the room there was this young lady, and she was sitting by herself, and she was all dressed in black, and she had a mourning band around her arm. So he asked his neighbor, "Who is this?" And he says, "Oh, that's Miss Hilda Tausig. She doesn't mingle with anyone." He says, "Invite her to the table." And this my dear Miriam, is how I met your mother. So he actually got to know my mother in the sense that he was interested in her from the very first moment that he saw her, and he wrote this in the diary. But she was much too withdrawn, and he knew, or he thought, that he could learn a little bit about her by drawing her portrait. Finally, after he waited a period of 3 years for his wife and child to come back, and of course, you know, that didn't happen. So they were married at in Prague at the old Jewish synagogue in May 1948. And one day he decided that he too wanted to come to the United States because he still had ambition to become famous, to become an artist, to be well known, and he wanted to show his paintings from the Holocaust. He wanted to bring them with him to the United States. He sent some samples to General Outdoor Advertising in Chicago, Illinois. My father then was invited to come to the United States, and he was literally taken off the boat, brought to the art studio in New York, and said, "Okay, choose something and paint." And he was essentially painting for his life here too, because now he was 61 years of age. He had a young daughter and a young wife that he had to support. He was in a canoe country with no money, so he had to be a success. There was no option otherwise. But so he started to do his sketch, and people started to gather behind him, just like when he was in Gleiwitz 1. And on the third day, the director flew in to meet this painter himself and see this wonderful portrait that he had made. And he was told that they would be very proud if they could hire him. We were moved to Chicago. And then after a few months, maybe almost barely a year, they made him the top man at the General Outdoor branch in St. Louis. He waited until he retired from General Outdoor Advertising. He started to write again, and then he decided that he needed to continue what was closest to his heart, and that was the pictures from the concentration camp. I knew what he went through because I was there when he made his second series. I was only 12 years old. So I watched him. He did those drawings for memory at that point. So when I left for school in the morning, he was already in his studio. And when I came home at night, he was still there. It absolutely consumed him.
Okay, so I'm going to bring Miriam in, and I want to just give you a little bit of background on Miriam. As you heard, she's the daughter of Auschwitz survivors David and Hildegard Friedmann. David Friedmann, a renowned Berlin artist during the interwar years, recorded his experiences on paper and canvas for the world to see. After his death in 1980, Morris was driven to carry on his mission to show his Holocaust art to the world. Works are represented in several institutions, including the United States Holocaust Museum, State Museum, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and on permanent display at the Holocaust History Museum in Yad Vashem. So as I'm honored to bring to the program, Miriam And Miriam, please take over. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching the video of the 2012 opening of Giving Music a Face. I will try to bring up my screen. Okay. This wonderful exhibition led to the 2013 exhibition of Painting to Survive, the work of David Friedmann, featuring a painting of Matilda, my father's first wife, at the German Consulate General in New York. My father would never have believed that the German government and German institutions would support and honor his work, and that members of the world-famous Berlin Philharmonic would play in tribute. The exhibitions were great triumphs for an artist who could not fulfill his promising career because he was a Jew. And this is what drives me. My father deserves the recognition robbed from him. The originals that surfaced are confirmation of a brilliant career that the Nazis could not destroy. The 1938 painting of Matilda was produced shortly before my father and his family escaped from Nazi Germany to Prague at the end of 1938. Matilda and their daughter Miriam Helene were murdered by the Nazis. The painting was my first discovery at the time I was a college student visiting Berlin. I knew my father as a prolific artist with many talents. The will and drive I saw in him carried over in my life. From childhood, I was intrigued about my father's pre-war life and unknown fate of his lost and looted art. What happened to the hundreds of etchings, lithographs, paintings, and drawings? His pursuit for justice inspired my quest to find works and to rescue him from obscurity. More than a decade after his death in 1980, pre-war work began to surface. Thus, it is possible now to present David Friedmann's life through art. So where did his journey begin? He was born in Marisch Ostrau in 1893, Austria-Hungary at the time, today Ostrava, Czechia. He apprenticed as a sign painter and ventured to Berlin at the age of 17. He studied etching with Hermann Struck and painting with Lovis Corinth. This is one rare painting from his early student years in the studio of Professor Corinth. Then World War I, the first of many life-changing interruptions in his career. My father wrote that he was permitted to draw and paint for himself and produce lithographs. The lithograph depicts warmly dressed soldiers in the hut. It survives published in a Jewish journal in Berlin. Several looted pieces turned up in the wartime collection of the Jewish Museum in Prague. The litho number 32 produced in Petrico, his last station during World War I, was quite phenomenal to have survived. This means he produced at least 32 prints of this very scene. Number 2 was found in Vienna by a US collector. Boys and their teacher in a Jewish school. This lithograph was looted by Reich authorities from the art collection of the Jewish community in Berlin and turned up at the Jewish Historical in Warsaw. So I learned that the Berlin Jewish Museum had collected my father's artwork. World War I ended. My father returned to Berlin and his art studio. With the creation of Czechoslovakia, he automatically became a citizen. He was disturbed to read about the pogroms in White Russia. To publicize the atrocities, he produced and exhibited 12 etchings about persecution and despair, foreshadowing his later work on the Holocaust. In 1954, my father received 2 pages of his work torn from this journal. He wrote, "These are the last and only evidence of my approximately 2,000 paintings that comprise my life's work." I was shaken to the core. I found the original etching at the University of Gießen in Germany. He was a successful painter and graphics artist renowned for portraits drawn from life. He exhibited at the Akademie der Kunst, the Berliner Secession, and numerous galleries throughout Germany and Czechoslovakia. This rare painting belonged to an art dealer and gallery owner in Cologne, who specialized in artists from the 1920s. A Freemason from my father's lodge made the dealer an offer he could not refuse and gifted the painting to me. The studio interior and furnishings are exactly as my father described in his restitution claims to Germany. The view of his studio is breathtaking and priceless. In 1923, my father learned of an international chess tournament to take place in Ostrava, his birthplace. He met with the former world chess champion, Dr. Emanuel Lasker, who was enthused about his idea of producing a portfolio of 14 players. My father's talent for portraiture and quick sketching played a central role throughout his life and saved his life also during the Holocaust. Although few originals survive, his portraits surfaced in newspapers and magazines. Besides chess tournaments and the symphony, it was delightful to find him at the opera, the theater, and at sport events. He sketched politicians and the scientists, the likes of Albert Einstein. In his career as a sketch artist, he produced hundreds of drawings published in cities throughout Germany and German-speaking countries. Some of his most famous subjects turned up in local papers like Max Liebermann and Thomas Mann. About 100 regional newspapers published press drawings just in Berlin. These publications had the absolute worst print and paper quality. Microfiche scanning adds to the more loss of soft shading and the fine detail seen in an original drawings. Despite all that, these are amazing finds, and it is so interesting to see the people my father met. My father was a classical violinist, and love for music was evident in his artwork. It was a thrill to discover not only world-famous musicians and composers, but also those long forgotten and obscured by the Nazis. These are among the lost portraits displayed in the 2008 Berlin Philharmonic exhibition, followed by exhibitions in New York and in Israel. When Hitler came to power in 1933, David Friedmann was banned from his profession and could only sell to Jewish clientele. This loss was a huge blow for a man who lived for his artwork. As a Czech citizen, he was permitted to establish a business renovating buildings until this too was published. Discoveries would show he did not forsake his art, as in this example of the great opera singer Alexander Kipnis. The Nazi regime allowed the Jüdische Kulturbund to exist as part of their efforts to mask the actual extent of their oppression of the Jews. In 1970, in the apartment of my father's non-Jewish sister-in-law, Käthe Friedmann, I found the painting of Matilda and 2 others that belonged to my father. He fought for the painting of Matilda. The other paintings are lost, despite my efforts to find them. At the end of 1938, the Friedmann family left everything behind in Berlin and fled to Prague. My father only had his artistic talent as a means to survive. His left behind artwork was looted by the Gestapo. He introduced himself to the leaders of the Jewish community in Prague. Many were prominent Zionists who became heads of Theresienstadt ghetto and then later were murdered in Auschwitz. My father made it known he wished to produce an album and received orders for portraits. His series of the Prague Jewish community, 1940-1941, is a historic record of a dynamic community that was destroyed. And in some cases, his portrait is the only surviving image of a victim. The album was donated to Yad Vashem. The Nazis aimed to deny all Jews their rights, and even the solace music provides. Nevertheless, Jews gathered for clandestine performances to experience a few hours away from the grim reality of their lives. The photo of the drawing is the only surviving document of this quartet. David Friedman wrote in his 1945 post-war diary, "Apart from the consequences for the Jews, for my poor family, the evacuation to the ghetto lodge gave my eyes, my inner being, a new direction. I saw something that I had never seen in this century. I experienced this tragedy not only with my eyes, but buried it into my inner being, into my memory, to tear out at a more peaceful time. These were powerful images that I saw, to give form to all that misery, to show it to the world. This was always my intent." On October 16, 1941, the Friedman family was sent on the first transport from Prague to the Lodz ghetto. In this deportation scene, the mother and child in center back bear a striking resemblance to Matilda and little Miriam Helene. His Prague art production was also looted by Nazi authorities. The following works from 1945 to 1948 are from his first series produced in Prague. His art shows the evolution of the Holocaust from his deportation to the Lodz ghetto and several concentration camps until his liberation. He supplemented his scenes with descriptions to create a singularly detailed pictorial and written record of the Holocaust. He produced more than 100 drawings and paintings in his lifetime. A garret to live in was a luxurious apartment in the Lodz ghetto. A garret is a small, unfinished part of a house just under the roof. These rooms were only 4 walls without running water or a toilet or any amenities. Many families lived like this, crammed into a small space. There was a pump in the yard that supplied the water. One came down from whatever floor one lived on with a bucket and turned the pump wheel and filled the bucket with water. The horrific hunger and destitution were the main subjects of his work. People were so weak they could not get up from the street. Starving children, peddling candy they made themselves was a common scene in the Lodz ghetto. Eating in a public kitchen or eating at home, the consequences were the same. Many Jews died every day from hunger and disease. So another scene my father witnessed of forced labor. Jews as horsemen in the Lodz ghetto. It is a sunny and hot day, but the Jewish people had to pull a carriage like horses, filled with bricks or stones. A German soldier dressed in white escorts the Jews. Since 1946 temper painting in muted browns shows a young and exhausted woman resting on a bed. This model was Hildegard Tausig, who would become Friedman's second wife and my mother. At a conference at the University of Lodz in 2004, I learned that David Friedman was a contributor to the Chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto, 1941-1944. This is one of the most important documents of Holocaust literature. The video showed damaged black and white photos of lost drawings from an album depicting the activities of a hat factory workshop. After decades of searching, the album turned up at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Also surprising were the colorized drawings. The titles are translated from Yiddish. Here is another miraculously preserved original drawing from the surviving album. With the Lodz Ghetto Bridge looming in the background, terrified Jews try to flee the Nazi roundup. At the end of August 1944, the ghetto was liquidated. My father was separated from his family and sent to Auschwitz, where his wife and little daughter were murdered. In Auschwitz, the violin saved him from sure death in the gas chambers. He volunteered for a camp orchestra and was sent with 16 selected musicians via open-air truck to the subcamp Gleiwitz I, also known as KL Auschwitz III. He played with cold fingers for the music director. In competition with concertmasters, he failed to win a position. He found his lifeline when he was ordered to produce portraits of the SS officers, the Nazi High Command. My father called these victims Musselmen, prisoners who were near death due to exhaustion, starvation, or hopelessness. They suffered daily torments by the Nazis and endless roll calls and selections for the gas chambers. The anguished faces express their desperate situation. This is a missing drawing from my father's first series that is lost in Israel. It was intended for Yad Vashem. And this is one of two of my father's iconic paintings of the Death March. It took 48 hours to reach the next camp, Lechhammer, in Upper Silesia, Germany. But the flight we took turned out to be a death march. That meant anyone who fell of weakness was shot down pitilessly. My father was liberated at Blechhammer on January 25th, 1945 by the Red Army at 51 years of age, an age significantly older than most survivors. His burning desire was to show to the world the ruthless persecution and inhumanity as practiced by the Nazis in the hopes that such barbarism would never happen again. He painted himself as a prisoner with the eyeglasses, as in much of his works, to show that he was also a victim and not just a witness. My father made his way back to Prague in June 1945. In Gleiwitz I, he had met František Kraus. They were joyful to find each other alive at the Jewish Community Center. Kraus was writing a book and asked my father to illustrate the cover, one of the first published testimonies after the liberation. My parents met in January 1946 at a health spa in a town near Prague. My mother, Hilda, had survived Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, the forced labor camp Christianstadt, escaped from a death march, and living as a German girl under the nose of the Nazis. She lost her twin sister and most of her family. The photo reflects her depressed state. My mother helped to hang my father's first Holocaust art exhibition at the town hall, likely the first of its kind in the world. My father was busy painting his vivid memories, having exhibitions, and rebuilding his life. 34 paintings and drawings toured the former Sudetenland towns near the German border. Announcements and posters invited Slav nationals to a celebratory opening and viewing of the exhibition, with compulsory attendance for ethnic Germans over the age of 15 years. Every visitor paid admission. Germans who failed to appear did not receive their ration cards. Friends and family, mostly concentration camp survivors, celebrate the Jewish wedding of my parents. Hilda's father, wearing a hat, is to her right. Living under the Stalinist communist regime, the marriage began at a refugee's pace. High-ranking military officers wanted my father's Holocaust art for the War Museum, but he had other plans. He defied an export prohibition and bribed the sympathetic official who stamped his paintings approved for export. The video skipped that my parents fled communist Czechoslovakia to Israel in 1949, before immigrating to the United States in 1954. Their first residence was this tent camp. Ever resourceful, my father discovered the hole in the barbed wire and took the next bus to Haifa to find his old friend from Berlin to get a job in his sign shop. And finally, after several months, they moved to their new home in Hadar Yosef, in this northern part of Tel Aviv. My father worked in advertising for 2 years and then for himself. He also freelanced for the newspapers. Every spare moment he painted for himself. His color palette had changed to a brighter, sun-filled hues as he left behind his old dark world to explore his newly adopted country. He produced portraits and painted landscapes, and also Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sites. Decades later, I had immense pleasure tracking down the dramatically changed scenery, some now difficult to find or non-existent. Sympathetic to the impoverished Jews who had emigrated from Yemen, he portrayed beggars on the streets to express their plight. David Friedman had captured the beginnings of the Jewish state. Israel was in a poor economic situation, and my father had a young family to support. Despite his age of 61 years, my father's ambition stretched to America. He had to forget what was hidden in his heart, the pictures from the concentration camp. General Outdoor Advertising agreed to give him a trial audition. The company didn't care about his age. They were looking how fast he could produce the gigantic paintings, and he was immediately hired. After 15 months in America, he became head painter at the St. Louis, Missouri branch. Instead of pictures from the concentration camps, he painted the iconic Clydesdales and happy folks selling beer on 2-story tall buildings. He received honor and recognition in this new career. We became American citizens in 1960, changing the spelling to Friedman with 1 N. After retirement in 1962, his art could no longer be silent. My father continued to fight anti-Semitism and race hatred through painting the horrors he could not erase from his memory. He wrote, "I wish everyone had to take a good look at this artwork. They have to look at what persecution under the Nazi regime was, and it can happen again. For in America, to be a Nazi, to be a communist is not prohibited. Against an evil world, I will work further to try to put my feelings down on canvas or paper against anti-Semitism, against race hatred of all people." He produced a second series of drawings and etchings titled "Because They Were Jews." In the 1960s, Holocaust art exhibitions was something new in the United States. My father was a witness to this horrific scene with his wife and 3-year-old daughter. All were forced to watch. My father was on the last train to Auschwitz on August 29, 1944. We were pushed and pressed like sardines, and the conditions inside were terrible. We could hardly breathe. 3 days without food, too. I will never forget this trip. It was like a hell. and only the beginning. Feeding time in Auschwitz. One plate of soup that was like hot water had to be enough for 2 or 3 men. After that, the Nazis pushed the prisoners with sticks and revolvers into the bathhouse, the gas chamber. Electrocution by choice. Some prisoners preferred the electric wire rather than more tortures. They worked hard, but lost their nerves and ability to think. The food was not even good enough for pigs. The object of this forced labor of carrying the bricks was to break the spirit. It had nothing to do with labor. The scene of this agonizing struggle in Gleiwitz 1 was produced 3 times in his artwork. And my father demonstrates this struggle in these photos, and also so that he could portray himself in this drawing, the prisoner with the glasses. A smiling, smoking Nazi looks on as prisoners bury a comrade. In the background, you can see 2 more prisoners digging a grave. This is the final drawing from the series of Because They Were Jews, which went on exhibition in St. Louis. And perhaps this was the first Holocaust exhibition in the United States. My father persevered and transformed tragedy into beautiful, creative life. He enjoyed painting landscapes, still life, abstracts, and portraits, and played his beloved violin until shortly before his death at the age of 86. He created over 200 abstracts, expressions of joy after the Holocaust. He died on February 27, 1980. He is recognized internationally for his contributions to Holocaust history and the art world. I love this portrait, this last portrait. His head held proud, his final defiance of that world he could not forget. My mother was dedicated to speak about their experiences and his artwork to teach the lessons of the Holocaust. She died in 1989 at 67 years. The Nazi regime nearly eradicated every trace of David Friedman, but they did not succeed. Everywhere he went, he left a legacy to be found in Germany, Czechia, Poland, Israel, and even in the United States. Finding lost art is gratifying and a priceless view into his pre-war life. It is an ongoing and challenging quest to create an inventory of his lost works. I carry on with my father's mission to show his art to the world. My goal is to continue publicizing his work through exhibitions, books, and film to preserve his legacy for future generations. I am excited to share the news that work will start on a documentary film by director John Rakosny with the working title, Dear Miriam. The Ghetto Fighters House in Israel has dedicated 4 programs as a homage to David Friedman. Please follow me on Facebook, David Friedman, Artist as Witness, at David Friedman 1893 for further updates. And thank you very much for your attention. I gratefully appreciate your time.
Okay, Miriam, if you can share stop your screen share, that'd be great. Thank you. What a beautiful presentation. And your father's witnesses, paintings is remarkable. So thank you very much. And we'd like to go now to the, anybody has a question for Miriam, I'll go to chat. There was one that I did see that someone asked you specifically what was Garrett described or known as luxurious? And whoever asked that question, please unmute yourself and you can ask your question directly to Miriam.
It was an ironic comment.
It's,
A garret to live in was a luxurious apartment because it was, at least it was a home. At least there was a roof over their head. It was not meant that it is a luxurious apartment, obviously with no toilet, no running water or amenities.
Jeanette Fishman, do you have a follow-up to that question? Okay, I don't hear you. So anybody now, if you could, go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and click it, and then raise your hand like you see me a hand go up. I'll be able to see you. And so Andrew, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Miriam. I wanted to ask if your father ever spoke more about the bricks that he was carrying to break his spirit, and you said that he was wearing his glasses in that, and you can imagine having glasses in a concentration camp and whatnot, and then if it really ever did break his spirit, or if anything like that ever came up through the artwork pieces, if you could talk more on that one especially.
Every Sunday, they had to go out and march 3 miles. They had to pick up their bricks quickly, and they had to march around, and anyone who fell or down was butted with a rifle from a Nazi, and they had to get up quickly. And this was a huge agony for the prisoners. And this reminded my father, this specific memory really bore on my father a lot, because he made, not only he made an etching of this and 2 different pieces expressing this agony of, it was a terrific horror for the prisoners, who also were malnourished and very weak. And this was their, what they had to look forward to every Sunday in Gleiwitz 1.
Okay, and Hank, you have your hand raised. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, it's a question. Miriam, thank you. A really, very compelling, beyond compelling presentation. You know, I want to ask something, and as comfortable for you, along with the legacy of your father's work. I'm wondering how his spirit, if I can put it that way, how his person has become part of you as you experience it. Whether there were, I mean, I don't know if you also are an artist, you probably are, but I don't mean in some literal, I'm like this, but, you know, how is he, how do you engage who he was in terms of who you are? It's a vague question, but whatever comes.
My father was like a hero to me. He was just so multi-talented, and I was an only child, and I was very much loved child. And we had a very happy home, and, you know, with music and dancing, and, you know, my parents were funny. So I grew up, you know, like any other child, except that I was a child of survivors, but we also lived in areas where there are a lot of survivors. So this was like normal for us. And I find that my father, we had like a very strong relationship. And I didn't even know how much he thought, how much and highly he thought of me, until I was much older, when I was looking through some of his graphic works and his billboard album, which I was donating to the Washington University in St. Louis. On the back, he wrote, "Mama and Miri, they go around town and they talk about my, my gigantic billboards, and then they come home and they say, oh, Daddy, Daddy, they're so wonderful." And I say, "No, it's Miriam. She's the talented one." So it was more like a mutual, you know, it wasn't, I was like, I could, you know, I was like the mutual love kind of relationship, where he taught me how to paint, and he taught me, I was very artistic, obviously. And what was striking to me was when I finally got to read his post-war diary, I learned that many of the things that he did with me, he had done with his first daughter. It was quite shocking because I knew so little about her. And she was extremely talented and spoke multiple languages. And so I really have to say that his spirit is within me. The will and drive that I saw in him carried over in my life. He was very industrious, as was my mother. They were always busy. He was typing or painting or he was always involved. He was making albums, and my mother was always by his side. And I think that I feel very fortunate to have this family.
Okay, I'm going to take the last question, but I'm asking if Benjamin Midler, Ben, can you unmute yourself? Ben, we're honored to have Ben. Ben is a survivor here, and can you speak to us, Ben? I know you're there. Okay.
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 Yes.
Hi. Nice to have you with us again.
Thank you.
So as you're processing Miriam's presentation, I know, please tell us quickly the camps that you were in, and you provide a unique experience. I know you were in Auschwitz as well. So please tell us what you thought, what camps and what you thought of the pictures that you had seen.
I was in 6 concentration camps, starting with Majdanek, being in Blizhin by Radom. After Blizhin, I was in Birkenau. From Birkenau, I was in Sachsenhausen, Ordruf, and Babelsberg. My experience was this: I had a very strong willpower to stay alive because I am the only one but went out from the hiding when the German caught me and they took me on the march to be deported. My family was still in the hiding place, and that kept me going because I want to see my family alive. Friedman's work is outstanding. I never saw work like that, and that's be for life for everybody. We can't forget. The life in the camps was very harsh, only because I was a young boy of 15 years old. So nothing for me was any hardship. And I overcome everything. And I'm now 93 years old, and I'm still speaking about the Holocaust to schools and everywhere, wherever wants me to speak. And,
thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to transition back to Zola for Zola's second song. So Zola, unmute yourself and bring your screen back, say something so you'll come pop into the screen.
So I did want to just thank Miriam. This was just overwhelmingly amazing. Thank you. Something that I forgot to mention, if you look at my screen, you will see in the top corner, there is a poster. That is a photo of an original poster from the Vilna Ghetto Theater, where they're advertising the show and my mother's name, Chaya Rosenthal. It was one of the musicals that my uncle had written. So 2 years ago, I was asked to perform at the Yom HaShoah commemorative event in Cape Town, South Africa, and they wanted me to sing something with the children from the Jewish Day School, the vocal ensemble. And I thought, it's time that I continue the legacy now, and I must write something in Yiddish, and I must pay tribute and honor my parents and my uncle. And so I wrote my first Yiddish-English song. And this is called Hört sich zu, which means listen, we will remember you. And the first verse has a bit of Yiddish, and the bridge does. And the translation is, listen to how we are singing. Our heartbeats are beating to the rhythm of your life. We are your children, we are singing, and we are here. We will sing your song because of you. And in the bridge, I sing in Yiddish, and the translation is, we will always remember you, we will never forget you, and it is because of you that we are here, and we will keep singing. Hört sich zu, wie wir singen, wie es klappen unsere Herzen. Mit Rhythm von euer Leben, hört sich zu. Wir seien euer Kinder, wir singen euer Lieder. Zu lieb euch, wir seien doch. We are here because of you. We'll tell your story, live your dreams, and sing your song. With courage, faith, and hope, with voices proud and strong. The world will know your life, your love, your legacy lives on. Hört sich zu, we will remember you. You're with us everywhere we go. We hold you safely in our hearts. We'll share with future generations all the lessons of your past, all your suffering and losses, all the pain that you've been through will never be forgotten. Hört sich zu. We'll tell your story, live your dreams, and sing your song. With courage, hope, and faith, with our voices proud and strong. We'll share the world will know your life and your love and your legacy. Hört sich zu, we will remember you. We have cried in all our tears the sadness of your darkest years, but the joy in your survival gives us life. Wir wollen euch keinmal nicht vergessen, wir wollen euch ständig gedenken. Auf ewig will wir singen zu lieb euch. We'll tell your story, live your dreams, and sing your song. With courage, faith, and hope, with courage all our lives long. The world will know your life, your love, your legacy lives on. Hört sich zu, we will remember you. Hört sich zu, we will remember you.
Beautiful, beautiful. And it allows some space to reflect from Miriam's presentation to upcoming's Hank. And what a beautiful, beautiful voice you present. And I love your background on your Zoom. It is so special as well to represent your parents there. So thank you so much, Zola, for contributing your voice to our program today. And
Thank you for inviting me.
Sure.
It's a privilege for me to be here.
And I want to now introduce Henry Hank Greenspan, who's a psychologist, an oral historian, and playwright at the University of Michigan Emeritus, who has been interviewing, teaching about, and writing about the Holocaust survivors since the 1970s. Rather than one-time testimonies, Greenspan approaches his craft by meeting survivors in sustained conversations over months, years, and in some cases, decades. The approach is reflected in his On Listening to Holocaust Survivors Beyond Testimony, now in its second and expanded edition, and Reflections, Auschwitz Memory and Life Recreated. He co-authored that book with Agi Rubin. Greenspan's play Remnants, which had a showing just a couple of weeks ago, also based on his work with Holocaust survivors. It was originally produced for radio and broadcast on NPR throughout the United States. It has been presented on stage at 300 venues worldwide, including the John Houseman Theater in New York, the New British Library, and the Magdeburg Attic Theater in the former Theresienstadt camp, a space used for performance during the Holocaust itself. And so I'm so proud to bring into the program Hank And Hank, you have the mic, so please speak and you'll take position. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey, and thanks to my fellow panelists, my fellow artists today, and heirs of artists, as well as artists themselves. It really is. And thanks, obviously, to those who are listening. I'm going to kind of move quickly because we've been here a while, and I want to get to something in particular from Agi Rubin was mentioned. And I think it may be a good place for us to finish, and so I will do that. And just a couple of things about this work that Jeffrey so kindly just described. Because I began interviewing survivors, an interview is a bit of a euphemism because it really was a kind of extended conversation, as he said. But it began with recording and audio tape and all of that. And in those days, in the 1970s, there were certainly projects. I mean, some immediately after the war, immediately after liberation, there were some very large collections in Europe, beginning in 1944, mostly organized and run by survivors themselves, historical commissions that have been mentioned. But there was not the kind of model of conventional testimony that we have today, conventional testimony collecting, the 2 or 3 hour interview for an archive in most cases, now videotaped, and usually with a stranger. My approach was not that. And I will say that because it was in the 70s, I had the luxury in the survivors, and I had the luxury of kind of making it up as we went along, to wing it effectively. And one of the things that we winged was just what Jeffrey described, which was to meet more than once. And this came really from the survivors. Not in every case, but in most. People said, so Hank, you'll come back next week, we'll talk some more. I said, we will. You know, I was a grad student, I mean, I had time. So I did, and that's how it began. And so 1 week led to another week, led to another week. And as you just heard, it was different degrees, different lengths of time, different numbers of meetings. And it's not like every time, especially for those people with whom I spoke over years, it was not like every time was about the war. The war was sort of there in the background, but it was interwoven with a full relationship, without talking about everything. And even the discussion of the war was, yes, it began, as most testimony does, with things that people witnessed and experienced at that time. But it led quite quickly to wider reflections on, well, where does that leave us? This is the kind of thing, of course, that I know from my students over the years, that many of us want to know not only what happened, but so where does it leave you? It's kind of the question I asked Miriam in an indirect way. So lots of discussion of faith in humanity, in divinity, discussion of politics, especially related to Israel, discussion of everything, including psychology. I always said that what I do is as much oral psychology as oral history. And of course, as you heard, I'm a psychologist, so this is an angle, an aspect of particular interest to me. I'm going to give you one quick example to give you the quality of one of these conversations. So one guy, a man named Abe, who sadly is no longer on the planet, who was one of the people I knew for decades. And Abe said early on to me, so Hank, you're a psychologist. So do you think we're crazy? Do you think the survivors are all crazy? And I treaded water, right? You know, I mean, I didn't, but I knew Abe would rescue me, as he always did. And Abe said, after a few beats, of course we're crazy. You'd have to be crazy to go through something like that and not be crazy, huh? Like a fox. And indeed, he was not crazy, but he did, as he also described, he had what he called his inner Nazis, those times when he feared he would lose everything. Again, his family, his business, his life, the new life that he'd made in the United States. And it would be crazy in a way not to have such moments just because it happened. Because it can happen again. And sadly, as we were talking earlier, there are things going on in the world and in this country now which are scary in terms of this, scarier than certainly in my lifetime I've ever seen. And as we know, many survivors feel similarly. So there was nothing crazy about that. But as you know, this was, once you know. Prima Levi, some of you will know, had a recurring nightmare after the war in which he's back, he's home, he's in Turin, he's okay, he's surrounded by at least surviving family, which for Levi was a number of people. But he'd have these nightmares in which it all disappears and he's back, as he said, in the camp in the locker in Auschwitz. And he never got out. Well, he did get out and he knew that. But again, as so many survivors described, he lived in more than one world at once. And so he was here and he was there. And that kind of complexity, that kind of juggling is what many survivors described over the years that I had the privilege of learning from them and learning with them. But just of many things that emerged from this opportunity to get to know people well and to go back to another meeting and another meeting and another meeting, especially early, is I would listen to my recordings between meetings. I would actually transcribe. I did my own transcribing. Now, any of us who've done transcribing know that if you want to get every and ah, yeah, an hour of interview may take 8 or 9 hours or longer of transcribing. No one types that I know anyway at the speed of speech. And so you really listen, you really engage, you really get inside. This made a big difference, I will say, in my playwriting too, that's based on this, because, you know, these voices and their little intonations and cadences became imprinted. But above all, anyone who listens to their own interviews, you know, becomes a backseat interviewer, as my students always do. But you become one to yourself, and you hear all the stuff that you missed. Oh my God, you hear all the stuff you wish you'd asked and you didn't, or the stuff you were sorry that you did ask. So, but knowing that we would meet again was incredibly opportunity, because I knew I could go back and clarify to see, I think, you know, I missed the boat here. And actually what I would do, I came to do as part of my own practice, was to bring to later interviews audio segments from earlier ones, from the last time we met. And I would play with the survivor. I'd say, you know, we were talking about this, and I think, I'm not sure I understood this. To be honest, they love doing that. I mean, so this was the sort of Talmudic practice in which we worked together to really, so we would listen to these excerpts, we would schmooze, we would get inside, we would take our time. This is a big lesson in my view of all of this kind of work, if you do it seriously, which is you have to take time, you have to do your homework, you have to be patient, you have to take it slowly at the speed of transcription sometimes to really hear what's going on and to have these conversations directly with the survivors. I quote in the description of the program my beloved Agi Rubin, another person with whom I spent many, many hours, years of close relationship. And Agi once said about her most memorable interviews, not only with me, but in general, one thought sparks another, and then another, that I may not have even known I had. That's the part that makes it so gratifying. Whatever I think I'm teaching, I'm learning at the same moment. We're learning together. We're learning together. That's the model that I've tried to pursue, and that I want to suggest we don't think about enough in our work, not only with survivors, but with others who've gone through hell, and maybe with the people in general. You know, whether it's a cultural thing or whatever it is, we tend to think everything is in one head or another head, right? So my story's in my head and I tell it to you, I transmit it to you, or my legacy, or my this, or my that. But we don't think quite enough of what happens between people, this process of learning together in conversation so that they get to places, conclusions, insights, reflections that neither one could have arrived at alone, that was in neither head until they had that conversation. In any case, this has been the model for me in my work with survivors, and I think in my teaching. It's what I believe in. As people who know me know, my favorite word is schmooze. When I say that, I don't mean manipulation, of course, I mean deep engagement, real conversation, yeah? So I'm gonna give you a couple more examples of this that hopefully make this even more textured. One man, we were talking about Radom a moment ago, a man named Leon, who figures centrally in my work, repeated the same episode in each of the first 3 interviews that we did together. This goes back to 1979. It was the only episode he repeated. And each time when he did, he said, this is the kind of thing I never remember or rarely do, because it was his word, traumatic. So I rarely get back to this. Oh, maybe I told someone once. Well, he had told me like 2 weeks earlier, but it was clear he didn't recall that. So here was a man who kept remembering what he said he almost never remembers without remembering that he kept remembering it. And I'm thinking, what's up with this? But thinking about retelling, what does that mean? What's going on with this? Now, I'm going to quickly tell you the particular episode. This was the only one, as I said, that he repeated like this, was about a privileged prisoner, a young, apparently charismatic guy named Huberman, 18 years old, who worked in the kitchen of a labor camp, which was adjacent to the Haram ghetto. It was a kind of SS storage facility. It was not a death camp. It was hell enough, but not a death camp. So this guy, Huberman, had access to food. And one day he had a loaf of bread and he smuggled it to his sister who was starving in a nearby camp. He was caught. And so the next day they took him out to join the work commando that Leon was in, which was one of the commandos, you will know of such commandos, whose job it was to go to the local Jewish cemetery and pull out the gravestones and smash them. And I can hear Leon saying this, to use to pave the muddy roads. You know, we all know that happened. So Huberman went with them, not his usual job in the kitchen, but went with this commando, SS corporal. Leon remembered the name of this corporal, a guy named Shvetka. Asked Huberman to walk in front of him, went a few steps, pulled out his Luger, and blew his brains out. And then Leon, along with a couple of other prisoners, were ordered to bury this Huberman man in the Jewish cemetery. You know, the very cemetery which was itself being unburied and spread on the muddy roads. So this was the episode that he kept coming back to. Now, I had my own theory, of like, why would that happen, right? And this is typically, to be honest, this is where academics usually stop. We have our own theory. What else is to know, right? And we think we already know. So there were things like, well, he had names and something happened. And this was in many ways not a typical Holocaust quote, whatever that means, because there's a specific name perpetrator, there's a specific name victim, something happened, he was caught, blah, 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 buried in the Jewish cemetery of all things. So I had my own theory, which, anyway. And I also made the rookie mistake. I was so interested in this that in our third meeting, when he repeated, I really wanted to know. Like, and so I made the mistake of asking him probably too soon, but I also knew, because we had, even by then, a very strong working relationship. I knew this was the kind of thing that he himself would be very interested in. He was always a brilliant man, very interested in the questions that I was interested in, which is this whole process of retelling and its complexity, and why you retell some things and not other things, and how there's a zillion things that matter in terms of what people say and don't say and how they say it. So, and being a psychologist, right, I could do it. It was in no way putting him on the spot. So I said, I've noticed each time we've spoken, we've come back to this particular incident. I wonder what you think, why that is. And I said just a tad about my own theory, which was my rookie mistake, one of my rookie mistakes. But then one of my favorite moments in all my years interviewing survivors happened. Leon said to me, and with a little frustration, you'll hear it even in the words, yeah. See, this is a good example of how hard it is to convey. You pose a question. I owe you an explanation. There are a few elements you couldn't have known. And there were a few elements I couldn't have known from the story itself as initially told. So he explained. He said, despite all the killing around us, we imagined this camp was a little island of security. And the Huberman incident destroyed the whole thing. You see, this was the moment of truth. Huberman was a favorite. Even to them, to the Germans, he was a favorite. And all of a sudden, we see No one's life is worth a damn. They would kill you with as much thought as it takes to step on a cockroach. And so our pipe dream was shattered right there. It was suddenly and dramatically shattered, along with Friedmann's skull. And then Leon described the shattering from the inside, which in all of these years now, 50 or so, that I've been listening and speaking with survivors, is probably the most vivid description of what trauma is experienced inwardly. The most vivid description I think I've heard. Leon said, it was a feverish feeling, a terrible intensity. It is like the only reality left over here is death. I wasn't aware of anything around me. In one moment, the universe became, what was real was only the turmoil within you. The rest was gone. The rest ceased to exist. The rest ceased to exist. Used with precision, trauma refers to overwhelming terror in the face of imminent destruction. In other words, no escape, deer in the headlights, no way out. And that's, of course, what Leon is describing, no way out. And one further aspect of this back and forth we had this day, which has become a very important part of my understanding and our relationship. In the course of talking about this particular memory, I asked one of those kind of half questions that interviewers sometimes do. I said, trying to understand better, I said, so this story, ... And I could have said, so this memory, so this episode, but I used the word story. The fact that I did triggered an immediate response in Leon. And what he said was, and it was not only about this episode, but in general about his retelling. He said, it's not a story. It has to be made a story. And with all the frustration that implies, because at best you compromise. You compromise in order to convey it. It's not a story. It has to be made a story. So if we had time, and we'll see if we do, and if there's interest, we'll talk about, well, wait, what is the not story? But what he's suggesting, at least, is that which can be told in the form of a narrative, in the form of a story, it's not even, the peak or the tip of the iceberg. It's one piece. You could say, I would say, that's things that can be told as stories in the context of this terror, what Primo Levi again called the total destruction of reality, are themselves survivors from all kinds of experiences, sensations, terrors that do not lend themselves to narratives. Doesn't mean they can't be conveyed at all. In fact, maybe in art, maybe in music, maybe in other media, more of it can be conveyed. But as far as narrative, as far as story, maybe not. Now, what's interesting to me is that if I had not used the word story in the context of everything else that happened that day, our discussion of this particular episode, the fact that we had met, the only reason I'd asked about that was because we'd met multiple times, was because he repeated the story, this particular one, was because I had a question, was because he was willing, because we had this relationship. And then I use this word, and then this comes out, this reflection about making a story of what's not a story emerged. And this is an example, along with its own importance, of what was in neither one of our heads. I did not go in to that meeting that day with this idea, as far as I know, of making a story of what's not a story. That, again, emerged from the relationship and the conversation itself, from the between, from learning together. That's really what I want to emphasize. Certainly wasn't in my head. It was in neither one, but he said it. Last thing just about this is that over the years, and it's turned out that this notion of how do survivors, quote, make a story of what's not a story, what does that mean? Become very useful to me in terms of understanding Leon and also other survivors whom I've known. And some of my colleagues, academic colleagues, have picked it up. Typically, they attribute it to me. It's interesting. They say, Greenspan says survivors, quote, make a story of what's not a story. Well, I didn't say it. Leon said it. But, academics, whatever, they give it to other academics. But the reality is, again, that yes, he said it, not me. I would say it was co-authored in the sense, again, that it wouldn't have been set at all, probably, if it were not for all of those contingencies, all of those almost accidental factors that led it to emerge in the context specifically of learning together, of what happened between us, okay? And that's what I want to emphasize. Another story of sorts that leads us to a related place. Jeffrey mentioned this play that I do. I'm not going to be doing any of it now. But one of the monologues, the last segment, actually is based on a story, based on a memory that Agi Rubin shared with me. As I mentioned, Agi was my surrogate everything, my co-author, my best friend, my teacher, my beloved person in my life. And so I do this segment of the play, and Agi often came to performances. And what I noticed after a while, because I often went with her when she spoke in schools or in other observances, that this episode would come up. And over time, when she would tell it, she would sound more like my version in the play than she did when she had told it earlier. Now, at first, that concerned me. I will say, I said, I almost felt guilty about it. Wait, like I'm affecting how you tell your experiences? I wasn't there. I just wrote this play. But you know, in thinking about it, I realized this happens all the time in life, yes? With friends. We tell a friend an important episode, something we went through, an illness, a trip, a transition, whatever it is. Maybe we've told it many times, but at this time, our friend comes back and says, you know, so it was a little like this. They give us a metaphor. They give us a connection. So this kind of like that other thing you said. Is this what you mean? And we'll say, yeah, you know what? Yes. They'll say something that really helps us, yes? Tell our own story. Next time we tell that particular story, we may very well draw on a connection, a metaphor, etc., that our friend shared with us when we spoke with them, when we probably won't pause and give them a footnote, or should we, obviously, and say, well, we'll just use it, we'll incorporate it. We do that all the time. And so this is what Agi was doing, of course, in this instance. She was borrowing back the story that, my version of the story that she shared with me, to retell it. So again, it's what happens between people that I want to highlight here, the back and forth. There was a time when I imagined the title for this talk was something like, it takes a village to tell a story. Well, in this case, it's not a whole village, but you know what I mean. Yeah? Memories, recounts, including testimony, emerge from not only one person, but in many ways, it's always a collective act. It's always more than one person. I say always, almost always, more than one person. And there's nothing about that that makes it any less important or essential than otherwise. So I argue, we can discuss. Last thing, I want to suggest the word of the day, legacies, can also be understood as a shared creation, as part of a learning together. As part of a learning together. And again, we tend to think of legacy like so much as transmission, as one-way bestowal. One gives the legacy to the next generation, very important. One gives it to the archives. It's transmission of legacy, of trauma, of testimony, whatever the thing is. One-way transmission rather than something, again, that happens between people. So this is Agi again. This is from the book that we wrote together, but this is, unlike the play, this is more pure Agi, I will say. And the only thing, the backstory for this is, as many of the survivors whom we know have described, the arrival, in this case at Auschwitz, in the selection, she was sent to the right. Her mother, her little brother, favorite aunt, cousin were sent to the other side, the side of death. Agi's 15. She doesn't know what's going on, of course, but she runs over. She wants to be with her family. The SS throw her down, kick her back. You know what that means. Put aside when you die, not you. So her mother, and that line is already moving away, but her mother sees this happening, and somehow over the chaos and over the din, she calls out to Agi, seeing her being thrown to the ground, said, "Go, my child, go. We will see each other tomorrow." Agi would then sometimes say, "And I've been going ever since then." Because of course, she never saw her mother again. So that's the background for this reflection of what legacies really are as she thought about them. She starts, the section is called Words, Survivor, Testimony, Legacies. These are the words that now describe who we are, what we remember, and what we have to pass on. And then she turns specifically to legacies. Legacies. Perhaps I'm haunted by this one most of all. We who are there know how limited can be any parent's ability to prepare the younger generation for what can happen. We know that terribly well. Still, we tend to question ourselves. Were we too protective or not protective enough? Should we have guided them more or let them learn from their own mistakes and their own successes? This goes for our own children, but also we ask it in a much wider way. We ask it, I ask it. But then I also think of my own parents, the legacy that I myself received. And I realize it is made up of so many small things that turned out to be precious to me. Things that I gathered up as much because I needed them as because my parents wanted me to have them. I barely remember my mother's face, but I remember her care, her love, and her principles, certain ways one tries to live one's life. My father, he survived, was with me through much more of my life. It was a full, mature relationship. And yet, when I think of him, I remember certain moments. I remember the way he sang Ein Kelohenu in our Jewish prayers. And whenever I'm at the synagogue, I hear his voice. At certain prayers or hymns, I remember how much joy he got out of singing that particular one. And when it comes up, he is again with me, and I am singing with him. It is the harmony of voices that makes the legacy. I repeat, it is the harmony of voices that makes the legacy. The way I tune myself to him and feel his spirit still singing through my own voice. Even now, we are singing together. So, actually, what is a legacy? It's these small things that are taken up by those who follow. I can provide whatever I can provide, but in the end, my legacy is not up to me. It is up to whomever comes after to pick up this bit, remember that part, find harmony with whatever note, as it may apply to their own circumstances, which I know will be different from mine. You will take what you choose, what you need, just as I did. I can only wish you well and wish you peace. So one last time in these pages, I remember my mother's wave, and I repeat what she said to me as she looked across the mud and the agony, trying to get my attention, trying to imagine a future, trying to invoke hope, trying to bestow the only blessing that in the end this world allows. Go, my child, go. Go, my beloved children and grandchildren. Go, my dear comrades and friends. Go, my kind listeners and readers. Go. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I am so pleased that we're recording this session with all of you because we can watch it and contemplate on it again and again. So thank you, Hank, for your contribution. I think it's appropriate that we open up the audience now for Q&A for you. And also, if the audience has a question for Miriam or Zola, we can do that now. I would like you to help me by using your hand raise as you see it on my screen, because it'll allow me to quickly pick up your question. That icon allows me to bring you forward to in front of everyone. So I'll open it up. Is there anybody who wants to start a question for our guests? Or it's Yom HaShoah program. You may have your own story to tell. So you're welcome to do that as well. I'm looking for hands. Okay. So I have a question for you, Hank.
Sure.
Maybe you can provide the audience with a little bit more depth in your Remnants program and play, and what are you trying to achieve? And do you have a next date which you can put in chat so people can, I know that you're always trying to get people to see your plays, so you have a targeted audience right here. So please.
Well, I mean, I've been privileged that Jeffrey, as you said earlier, did it recently, and it's online. There's a recording of the recent performance, which will be online up through April. So I don't know if I can stop everything and go get the link, but it's a YouTube link. All you have to do is go and there it is.
What's the name so they know?
Well, it's called Remnants, but you wouldn't be able to find it. It's a private YouTube link, so I would have to go get it and put it up. And
well, if you do me a favor, if you send it to me, I can forward it to anybody, and anybody who wants to wants the link, you can get me a note in my private message on Facebook, and I'll take care of it.
I will. And you asked me what I'm doing, and you probably get from some of what I said, I'm not a takeaway kind of guy. I'm not a lessons guy. I mean, there are obviously, but it's the relationships that are most important to me, and the relationships with survivors and the relationships that lead out from that, meaning with my students who over the years were able to kind of share some of this journey. When survivors would come to my class, we had these same kind of moments when my students would ask questions, and survivors say, I never thought about that before. So it's all the deepening and widening of the conversation. And so this piece, among other things, it's challenging, it's unremitting in its way. And I don't mean because of horror, but because of the ways that it indirectly challenges some of the rhetoric, some of the ritual that tends, in my view, sometimes to get in the way of engaging some of the reality. And again, I don't just mean horror reality of these events. Some of the human beings, as human beings, particularly human beings. And it doesn't end with unlike what I just read from Agi, it ends, well, it is like that. It ends without resolution. I mean, I won't tell you what it is, but there's an image which is not complete. It doesn't resolve. There's no higher synthesis. It's a contradiction. Wiesel once said, whatever we say about this history, the opposite is usually also true. And I think that is quite right. And I think we need to tolerate that kind of irresolution, because it's how the world is, and it's certainly where this history leaves us in a number of ways, except the undeniable fact that hell happens and has happened and it still happens, and that's real. That there's not two sides of that in my view, but otherwise they're not. So the main thing about this play, and the part that I most enjoy genuinely, is not the performance. I enjoy that too, but it's the schmooze, it's the discussion that happens after, which often goes on at least as long as the performance. That's when we really get into stuff. That's really in the moment. And that's the purpose of it. And I will say over the years, it works in that way, that people want to talk, people want to reflect. So that's what's gratifying.
Okay, Arnold, you have your hand raised, so go ahead. I think I know what you're going to ask, but go ahead. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah, unmute yourself, Arnold, please.
I was not going to ask Jeffrey, but if you think it's appropriate, I did want to recognize the passing away of someone who meant a lot to all of us, a survivor, by the name of Gerda Weissman Klein.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Some of you knew her. Many of you heard about her. I had the privilege of getting to know Gerda over the years. She wrote a book, All But My Life. I recommend it strongly to all of you because I felt it was unique in that she presents the horrific and tragic events she experienced as a survivor, the marches, the camp experiences, and so on. But throughout the book, she provides you with hope, the hope that saved her life, she felt. The memories of family, anniversaries, birthdays, a good grade in school. And I think that's what makes that book so unique. She was liberated, and but before the Germans fled Auschwitz, one section of Auschwitz, she and others were locked in a barracks and were told there would be a bomb going off, killing all of them. And as I recall, this goes back many years, they were saved when there was a torrential rain and the bomb did not go off. So when the Allies came in, they were called out of the barracks. They lined up as was they were conditioned to do. And as some of the Allies marched up and down, one of the soldiers came to her and she came to attention and read off the number on her arm. That soldier reached out, touched her and said, "You can relax. I'm an American. I'm here to liberate you." That man became her husband, Kurt Klein. Later, Gerda and Kurt developed a documentary which won an Academy Award when Kurt had passed away. But when Kurt received the Oscar, they played the music after she spoke a while to kind of usher her off the stage, as many of you have seen when they have the Oscars. And she stopped them and said, "I've got more to say. I went through a lot and I'm going to finish what I have to say." So then the final just memory I have of Gerda is that there was a young leadership group, and I happened to be with the Federation in New Orleans and would arrange for the speakers. And so one year we brought in Gerda. Never again did I have to question what the group wanted. They always wanted Gerda to return, succeeding classes because of what they heard about her. My wife was elected to be in that group, but the night before Gerda was going to speak, Barbara had our third child. And when I told Gerda why Barbara couldn't be present, she said, "Oh, wonderful, that was my birthday yesterday." 2 weeks later, we received from Gerda a sweater wrapped in green tissue paper. When you opened it up, on the sweater was a rose, and it was with the wishes, may your life be a garden of roses. So I just wanted to mark her passing with those thoughts.
A quick comment about Gerda, if I may. Her memoir, All But My Life, was originally published in the 1950s and was mostly unknown, except for a few people. And it was much later that, thanks to Spielberg Project and others, that picked it up, that it became what it became, and that she became as known as she then was. And this is a story that repeats itself many times. There are many memoirs that we'll never know. And many, when they were first published, essentially went unread. Primo Levi, again, I keep mentioning Levi because he happens to be Levi. But his work was almost entirely lost. Rizal's work was almost entirely lost. And of course, the folks who we never heard of were. So, you know, it takes nothing away, obviously, from Gerda and who she was and what she wrote. It's just that these, what we take for granted, are also survivors. You know, these accounts, and out of many stories, you know, that we happen to know and have had the privilege to hear and read, out of so many that we have.
Okay, Mark?
Just one other thought, and that is, I just want to thank Hank and Miriam for their stories. And I thought Zola's music just complemented both stories so well that it was, Jeffrey, congratulations to you for bringing together all these elements that really created a wonderful experience for all of us, a meaningful experience for all of us today.
Mark, please unmute yourself and talk to us.
Yeah, I have to say I was very, very moved by the program today and also the last program. My parents never spoke about the Holocaust much. And my father, I think, he always thought the Holocaust was going to happen again in America, which surprises me in a way because he never did talk about it to really prepare us. I've always been fascinated by how different people reacted or were affected by the Holocaust. My stepfather, for example, who was from Sosniovich, was one of the most wonderful, kind people I ever met. Very, very positive. Whereas my father was very cruel, very abusive, and very paranoid about the Holocaust. Hank, did you find that different people reacted in different ways? Do you have any theory about why that happened?
My only theory is that sometimes I say this and people get upset, because survivors are us. In other words, they're as diverse a group as any other. It doesn't mean we're survivors, obviously, and it doesn't mean it was entirely, as you know, many survivors say, well, it was luck. And there was a lot of, again, entirely unpredictable reasons, which didn't mean their own resilience and skills and talent and privilege sometimes mattered. But in general, and I think, if they're not us, then why does it matter? In other words, because behind the survivors, the much, much wider group of those who didn't survive. And it's not those Holocaust people, that's us. This is our history as human beings. So, that's, I think that's just important. And it's another thing that upsets people sometimes when I say it. Surviving the Holocaust was not a meritocracy. Yeah, there are all kinds of reasons. Again, didn't necessarily, there were saints, as we know, among those who survived and those who didn't. And there were not such saints. And most people were just like us, again, were a combination of a lot of different things in the whole range. So that's what I'd say. It's not a question of why this and why that. I think, they're us. So the fact that for whatever combination of reasons, they were able to come out on the other side of that hell is fantastic.
The impact, though, when I do presentations, and I don't do that many, I call them taming my monsters, because basically the Holocaust was always the shadow in my life, but I knew so little really about the specifics. And I think it's so important that we have programs like this. And Jeffrey, thank you. I've learned so much and I really am grateful. Thank you.
Okay. And you have your hand raised, Andrew, so please unmute yourself and ask your question.
I just wanted to thank everybody involved. I maybe not a question, maybe I'll comment on it back. And that it was just very ironic or coincidental, because I didn't know about this event or anything about this more than 12 hours ago. I was scrolling through Twitter and having a conversation with a friend, like Hank was saying about, having conversations and having a knowledge come out of that relationship and conversation. And granted, that was 2 a.m, so maybe I shouldn't be doing that.
It's the best kind.
Right?
Best kind.
And we were talking about art and some other stuff. And it just evolved into it, because maybe I wouldn't have had that conversation had I not gotten into art during and tried to relive my childhood during the lockdowns of the pandemic. And so just understanding all of that stuff. And now I find myself here 12 hours later because I saw Miriam's post on Twitter about all this art, and I didn't know anything about David Friedman. And I, that's what I'm saying. It was just so beautiful for me to feel that. And like Mark said, feel grateful for all the knowledge and experiences shared today. I went, I'm not of the Jewish faith or culture, and I went to a Jewish law school, Cardozo Law School under Yeshiva University. named after our first, Jewish Supreme Court justice. We talked about a lot of those things, and it was refreshing to see the faith and culture in my education after being in public school in New York City the whole time. But at the same time, you know what they say, a picture doesn't, it's worth 1,000 words and more. So, Hank, we could talk here all day, and I'm sure we would have a lot of great things to come out with. But seeing the artwork and hearing the music just evokes that emotion, the art that does it. And it's just good, especially after law school and a pandemic, to come out here and just be in touch with all of that. So thank you all, honestly, and keep pushing it to the younger generations, because
you're welcome. You're welcome to join us. If you put your email address in the chat, I'll pick it up. And our programs are available to anyone. You don't have to be obviously Jewish to come. So that's good. And I wanted to ask Ursula, do you want to contribute anything? You need to unmute.
I want to speak something.
All right, hold on a second, Ben.
As usual, I'm really taken very deeply, very moved, very deeply.
Okay, Ben, go ahead.
Ms. Enk was speaking people living with the past. I have a brother-in-law. We were married in the same day, and he was in the concentration camps like me. By living in the past and in the future, he died of age 55. Nobody could live with the past. I'm speaking to the schools, only I never think about the past. Always we gotta look for the future. Wherever it's happened, I want to educate all the people what's happened should never happen again. And that's why I even wrote a book, The Life of a Child Survivor from Białystok, Poland. My brother-in-law died of age of 55, and I'm 93. That's the difference between living in the past and living in the future. Thank you.
Very interesting. One of the things I would like to ask each of our presenters, and I'm going to ask you, Ben, as well, and anybody else who's on, because we're quickly wrapping up here, is to tell me what is on your bucket list. So, Ben, I'll start with you. What's left on your bucket list?
To speak to schools. I got 2 schools to speak in one day, on April 27, on the Holocaust Day, on April 28th. And
what are you doing on July 17th?
I'll be speaking here on this.
We have a program including Ben on July 17th. He's part of a trifecta of speakers, and we're thrilled to have Ben on and giving his testimony, his story, his legacy, and where he's moving forward. So, Miriam, what's on your bucket list? You have to unmute yourself, please. Unmute. We can see your mouth working, but no sound coming out.
I believe you mean my bucket list for the future?
Yes.
Well, I am hoping to have exhibitions of my father's artwork. That was kind of ended because of the COVID. I actually had 1 or 2 exhibitions planned, and it seems to be very hard now to get that off the ground again. And I have to finish my manuscript, which has been waiting in the wings. And soon I'll be embarking on work on this film by the director of the film that's out right now, We Survived Together, John Rakosny. And the film, the working title will be called Dear Miriam. It comes from when my father wrote me letters, and he wrote, "Dear Miriam, I was once a famous artist. I was known for these chess portraits." And this is how, it began, my interest to find out what happened to my father's artwork. And when I found the painting of Matilda, and I saw how meaningful it was to my father, this laid the groundwork for my future work, because you couldn't do that in the 70s and the 80s. We had to sort of almost wait for the internet. And then I learned the most valuable lesson: you have to go to the institutions. You have to go meet the people. And I went to Europe several times, did a lot of research in archives, at museums, and it was really quite a journey, reconstructing my father's life through art.
Hank?
Well, I'll give a specific and a general. The specific thing is I'm working on a new play, which after all of these years focused on survivors is about those who did not. Very specifically, the protagonist in this piece is a guy that some of you will have heard of, Rubenstein, who was known as the Mad Jester of the Warsaw Ghetto, a trickster, well known in the ghettos, and someone who's fascinated me since I was first reading about this history, going all the way back. So that's a specific thing, but the bigger thing is that, you know, I see my mission as, again, to do whatever I can to facilitate worthy conversation about important things. And my God, you know, in this world, there's no shortage of need. So it has less to do with individual achievements or even projects than that general project. Because whatever, for me, project I'm doing, its ultimate utility, its usefulness, its contribution will be measured by the conversations that it may help facilitate, stimulate, and so on.
And Zola?
It's really to continue to do what I'm doing. And in recent years, the bucket list what added to the bucket list was, since my family passed and since my sister passed specifically, because she was the big family historian and out there in the world, I really want to share more and tell more and go to more schools and just keep building on the story of sharing with the next generation. The stories of the memoirs of, not the stories, the experiences.
Yes, but I do want to make a connection. I'm a consummate networker, so Yvonne Lazar is on screen. Please unmute yourself, Lazar, Yvonne, because Yvonne, I think you're from South Africa. I'm not sure where, but
yes,
I wanted to make an introduction to you.
Hi.
Hi, I'm also from Cape Town, but I probably left there before you were born. I left in the 60s. I've been out of Cape Town. I lived in Israel after that for 10 years before coming to the States. But very nice to meet you, and your singing is beautiful, and it's so very meaningful. My father had got out of Germany in 1936, but his mother and sister were amongst from Cologne, Germany, and they were amongst those people who said the Germans are going to come to their senses. This is going to blow over, and they stayed. And my grandmother died in Theresienstadt, and my father's sister died in Auschwitz. So I was 16 when he was 16 when, I'm sorry, I'm getting this mixed up. I was 16 when he passed away. And he had never, ever spoken to us. I mean, I knew about the Holocaust. I just assumed our family had all died in it, other than him and my mother. And I knew nothing. So I did a search when I was 70 years old. My first time that I found out what really happened to my family. But very nice to meet you.
Same here. My sister often asked my mother to talk to her and tell her stories, and she wouldn't. And she always said, better you shouldn't know, and it's better not to talk. And my sister titled the play, Better Don't Talk, for that reason. And her book she titled No Goodbyes, because nobody had the chance to say goodbye.
Okay,
and there's one more connection here tonight. Harriet Benish is a singer and a performer from Los Angeles, and she often sings my Uncle Labe's songs. And she was instrumental in making a connection for my song, Hört sich zu, to be sung by the Los Angeles Jewish Children's Choir, which Rabbi Green organized.
Beautiful.
So there's a lot of our connections happening.
It's a small world, as I travel around the world through this little computer that's in front of me, it's quite amazing the stories I'm learning, the connections I'm making. And before we close, I want to give anybody on the program to answer what's next on your bucket lists. And you can just raise your hand. I'll give you the floor and you can tell us. And then I'll wrap it up and with our next program. But does anybody else want to give us anything on the bucket list? Eva? Joanne?
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Different Eva?
No, you're the Eva I'm talking to.
Okay. I was invited to speak in April, toward the end of April, before Yom HaShoah for Zikaron Besalon by the Jewish Federation and JCRC. And the following day, Best Buy Corporation invited me because of Yom HaShoah. So I will be speaking. And then I am on I think in June, I'm speaking to you. And I just want to say how touched I was today. What a program. I had tears in my eyes listening to Miriam. And Miriam, there is so much that I feel like I have in common with you. I'm also an only child. I grew up in Czechoslovakia, very loving family. And there was constantly music and laughter but my parents did speak about their experiences. And anyway, and Zola, I'm so touched by your beautiful voice and the beautiful lyrics of the songs. And Hank, thank you, all of you. And thank you, Jeffrey, for each and every time. Your programs are amazing, very powerful. Thank you.
And Sarah, I know you wanted to add your thoughts, so unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you everyone for everything that you guys have shared. My bucket list thing to this year is to finish my novel, the first of my trilogy. I feel I'm sitting here watching my candle burn for people that I've known who have been through the war and the Holocaust. And I have yet to finish this book that has been on my heart to finish for years. And I think the time is now. And I'm setting myself a goal to have the manuscript finished and ready to be submitted for publication by the end of the year, because it's been long enough and I think it's time. And hearing everyone's stories, it makes me understand that now more than ever, considering the way that the world is going, now more than ever, this book needs to be finished and published and put out there for people to read, to bring awareness to what happened. So I thank everyone for all of your stories. And Hank, you have, I want to pick your brain because there's so many questions. I have way too many to go on to a show like this, but
not today.
Yeah.
But I'm easy. Just give me an email or whatever, and we'll schmooze.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of things I want to. Yeah, you really sparked something in me that I need to get more answers to. So thank you very much. And Zola, I love that song. It is, I think, out of all the songs I've heard pertaining to the Shoah, that one speaks to me more than any other song I've ever heard. It's so powerful. When I hear you sing that, I hear voices standing up of the people that I've met who are survivors, and most of them have passed, but I hear them telling me, make sure the story gets told. And I'm sorry for getting emotional, but it got
me crying. Thank you. It was written as a tribute to all the survivors, to all the families lost, and to the future generations as a promise.
Yeah, and Miriam, your father's artwork is powerful and moving, and I would love to see more of his artwork. It's amazing. If you could send me a link to where I can see more of it, I would love to see it.
I did post the links, but if you can't find them, if you just have to Google David Friedman 1893.
Okay.
And you could find, but if you send me your email, or contact me, I'll be glad to send you those links.
And Sarah and everyone, if you want to get in contact with one of our speakers, just send me a note on private message. I'll be happy. They'll be happy to contact you, and I'll put you in touch. We're just gone over a little bit over. I think it's a great time for us to close the meeting. I want to let you know, obviously next week is Easter, so we are skipping next week and we're going on to the Sunday, April 24th. It's a very special program. It caps the 3-part series. It's with the Butterfly Project and their amazing work to educate our youth in K3 to 12 about Holocaust lessons and against hate. They use creative arts, ceramics, to have children paint. And Benjamin knows full well because he's partaked in the Butterfly Project, and they will be coming on to tell us about their program. That'll be the short version of the program, about 30 minutes. 90 minutes will be survivor storytelling and your storytelling about one of the family members that you may have lost in the Shoah. And the program will be recorded and will continue until everyone has a chance to speak. So if you know a survivor and want to bring them along to the program, please use this invite to do so. You have the same link that you came in today to use. If you want to invite a guest to be on the program, please bring them as well. And this program will be is recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel literally later this afternoon, evening, or tomorrow, depending on my schedule. So you can share that program, watch it again, and all of the programs. We now have over 13 programs like this on the YouTube channel for you to see, and all future programs will be loaded there as well. So thank you very much for coming today, being part of this special program dedicated to my parents, and have a great weekend. Bye, guys.
Peace.
Peace.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.